Welcome to It's Only Up From Here, a space to revel in the alchemy of transformation, a space to be a nudging light at the end of the tunnel, a space to remind you you've been your own hero all along. This is Lauren, your host of It's Only Up From Here. What does it mean to really live free? What does freedom mean? There's a quote from The Princess Diaries a person recently shared with me that goes, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the judgment that something else is more important than fear. The brave may not live forever, but the cautious do not live at all." The quote resonated with me a lot. In fact, the person shared it with me for good reason. I'm currently going through a transitional period in my life and where I had to have courage. A period where I have been so deeply afraid and fearful of the unknown. And also, admittedly, I have been fearful of the weight of the pain that comes with this transitional period. So much, in fact, I was paralyzed by fear. But the idea that courage is the judgment that something else is more important than fear, that really hit, to be honest. That struck me as very true. Because in all balanced transparency, the transition I have been going through these past weeks is about parting ways with someone I deeply love and care about. But it was very much time for the time being. And although I was deeply fearful and still am about this next chapter in my life, I did come to the decision that this person's heart and time, including mine, is more important than any fear I have about being apart from them or being alone. If courage is the judgment that something else is more important than fear, then maybe what I did was courageous, even if it doesn't quite feel like it. And I'm sure other folks have had that experience. It's funny. All week long, loved ones have been telling me, "Lauren, you're so courageous. You're so brave. You're so strong." But the truth is, I've honestly never felt so small and so scared and so completely alone in my life. I've never felt so much like I'm falling through the air with nothing to grab onto to stop me from falling. So that begs the question of, what does courage actually look like when you're falling apart? I think about the memory of 6 years ago when I made the decision to uproot my life and move to New York City. I think about those months leading up to my move that did take a ton of courage. But I was also falling apart. And I felt like everything I ever knew, everyone I had in my close orbit was falling far away from me because I knew I was leaving my old life behind. But even though that moment of courage was marked by fear and the feeling of unraveling, it still worked out in the long run. And it led to a more beautiful and expansive and rich life than I could have ever imagined had I stayed stuck in fear. The truth is, when I made the decision to part ways with this person, I had that similar terrified feeling to 6 years ago. I felt like I was blowing up my life a little bit, or losing the very thing that made me feel brave and strong, like a baby without their security blanket. That's how I felt for a while. That's how I still feel. I was with someone for a while whom I loved and cared for deeply. Someone who showed me for the first time the type of love that could be. And while I know the bar is an absolute hell for men, this person treated me better than anyone had in a very long time in this city. And that was unexpected. This person wasn't perfect, and neither was I, but I cared deeply for this person. Honestly, almost more so than I cared for my own needs at times. Sometimes I hid a lot of my needs. There were some very deep incompatibilities that I ignored for a while, followed by other situational issues and things that transpired, which I ultimately couldn't look past for the time being. And coming to that realization was so terrifying because I didn't and don't want to lose this person. So I did the hardest thing I've done in a really long time, and that was choosing to part ways out of love, not out of hate, but deciding to part ways before we came to hate or resent one another. And that's honestly the bravest and kindest thing I think anyone can do in a relationship. It's interesting because, like I said, in the aftermath, so many people have called me brave or strong or resilient, and it's almost a pressure that comes with those words. You feel at times you have to live up to it, not slip back into old patterns, not slip back into a moment of calling the person crying because you miss them so much. I mean, how many times have you either been the brave or strong friend or known one, and those feelings that it comes to live up to being brave and courageous and resilient. Not that anyone is doing anything wrong by seeing you as strong or brave, but there comes almost an embarrassment when you feel you're faltering in that strength. And there's almost this fear of, what if I can't live up to the identity of being courageous and strong? What if I'm weaker than my loved ones and my peers view me as such? There can often be a disconnect between how others see you versus how you feel internally. A long time ago, I was reading about how there's like a word or expression in Japanese. There are two words actually that represent the conflict between how others, the outside world, see you and then how you see yourself. And please, no internet stranger bash me on my pronunciation because I do not speak Japanese. I'm so sorry. But the phrases are hane and tatemai. Hane is like your true private self desires, while tatemai is the facade or public face presented to society that's more acceptable. And I don't know, those terms always stuck out to me ever since I read about them. And I was reading that these phrases can be applied in one-off social exchanges or settings, like maybe finishing your food at a guest's home, even if you're full and don't want to, but you're just being polite. You know, something to that nature. But it also made me think about how others can see you differently from how you view yourself. And not even in the sense of you have low self-esteem, but you just honestly might view yourself differently. You might have a different, true, private desire about yourself versus the facade that's presented to society. I often feel more faint-hearted than my loved ones see me. So it was a surprise when these past few weeks I have been called the opposite. The week leading up to this major transitional period was incredibly anxiety-inducing and scary. And to be honest, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I couldn't think about anything else but this person and how badly I didn't want to hurt them or myself even. In fact, I tried to ignore what I needed to do. I tried to push it down, stuff it in a closet, shut it away tightly. Then like clockwork, it felt as if my brain had this door. And at that door, someone or something began knocking over and over all week long. And I made a feeble attempt to ignore the knocking, but it only grew stronger. And it was like there, in every room inside my head, was the large elephant that I needed to end this relationship for the time being. And as time went on, the knocking on that door grew louder and louder and louder until the weekend came and someone was pounding on my fucking door, nearly splitting the wood of it open. I began to grow restless, anxious, and on edge. I felt like everywhere I turned, people could see right through me. I felt like I was a translucent, hollow shell of a person who was holding on to a truth that I wasn't saying. And I felt like everyone around me knew it. I felt like a fraud of a strong woman. And more importantly, I felt afraid. More afraid than I felt in a very long time about anything. I was afraid of saying goodbye, whether temporarily or permanently, to someone I deeply loved and cared about. I was afraid of losing my support system and confidant. I was afraid of losing the person who made me feel brave and confident and supported and who I thought made me feel strong. Isn't that crazy that the presence of someone else can make you feel that way? I started to doubt if I was really all those things without this person. And like I said, I felt I was falling without anything to grab onto. And sometimes falling isn't one moment. It's often a slow unraveling. And I could feel myself unraveling by the seams faster than I could ever stop it. I told a friend one night that I felt I was bracing myself for impact. The impact of a breakup, and that it was going to hurt so bad I would never recover. And then this friend said something that stuck out to me. She said, "Do you think you're so afraid it's going to hurt so bad because you're basing this on other experiences in your younger years, where a breakup or parting hurt you tremendously? You're stronger now than you were then." And then she went on to say how she thinks I'm also shell-shocked from the past. A little PTSD, if you will. And she was absolutely not wrong. I did have a tumultuous 20s. I'm shell-shocked by many things of my past. And if I could share some words of wisdom with anyone, I would want to share what my friend shared with me that night. That sometimes we're so deeply afraid of something in life, whether a big transitional period, a breakup, a big move, etc., because we're basing it off another time, something from our past, where something like that deeply hurt us. But not every time will feel like that. Not every parallel experience will feel the exact same, especially as we grow older and grow wiser and more mature and more balanced mentally. Like, when they say the prefrontal cortex matures around age 25, I truly felt that. And I think it's so funny. Like, when I say I vividly remember at 27 and 28 starting to feel more sound mentally, I mean it. It's like a flip switch in your brain, and you're like, logic, sound, reason. It's funny to me. But with all that being said, I still have times where I falter because I'm human. And I was really afraid during this transitional period. But when my friend said that to me, it was like a light bulb went off that maybe, just maybe, it was going to hurt, but not nearly as badly as it would have when I was, say, 20 and much more emotionally fragile and with much less experience in life. Shout out to my friend Kels for that nugget of wisdom. So, spoiler alert, the transition did happen. The parting of ways happened. I surrendered my security blanket, and it hurt like absolute hell. And it still does many days. But I'm still standing. I'm still forging a path forward. And I think that's what matters through it all. I think about what it is about this person that made me feel so safe. Maybe because they saw me through all of my quirks and idiosyncrasies and still accepted me. They saw me on days where I felt ugly inside and out and still loved me. But there were many things that were not all well. So there was still a truth in where we needed to part ways with love for the time being before it turned to hate and resentment. And it feels scary to not have this security in this person anymore. Because while I have platonic relationships, and I've talked about the deep importance of platonic and community relationships on this podcast, there is no world in which they can completely replace romantic ones. They just cannot. They're not supposed to. Every type of relationship fulfills a facet of our lives. And I was letting go of a relationship that filled a part of a gaping hole I had in my heart and soul. But in the end, I realized that wasn't enough. I realized I wasn't entirely filled. And I realized this person wasn't entirely filled. Not at this point in time. And periods like these, where you realize you need to part ways with someone for the betterment of both of y'all, are very painful. It's a painful, painful realization. But it's thoughtful and it's considerate. And while it may feel like you have lost something, you didn't lose anything. You made a kind decision to release them with grace and love. Nothing was taken from you or lost. In fact, if anything, a decision like this preserves the sincerity of the relationship you shared with this person. It preserves the relationship with kindness and genuine love for one another. It took me a while to get to that moment where I could realize that, where I had the wherewithal to ask myself, is your pain coming from loss, or is it coming from who you were when you had this person? Is my pain coming from loss, or is it coming from the support that they gave me? Maybe a lot of the pain I experienced from this parting was actually the pain of the absence of a version of myself I was when I had this person's love and affection. And I'm sure that might be true for many of us. And me saying this is not to invalidate or minimize the pain of missing the person, because there's also space for that too. You can miss the hell out of someone and still know you all need to part ways in this season of your lives. I can safely say I miss this person all the time, and I have no shame in that. There's something beautiful in knowing you chose what happened to your life and future. There's something beautiful in knowing you chose love, kindness, and consideration over fear and the urge to cling on to someone selfishly. There's something beautiful in knowing you took control of your life and your heart and your needs. There's a quote by the French-American writer, Anais Nin, where she writes, "Had I not created my whole world, I would certainly have died in other people's." And when I think about that quote, I don't mean it in the way of like, I would have died in my partner's world. Because like I said, this was someone who was not only very special to me, but someone who loved and admired me and respected me and cared about me and vice versa. But I think about that quote in the context of you have to create your own future. You have to do what's best, even if it hurts in the moment. I could have stayed with this person because I could have been worried about how it would have been perceived to friends and family and acquaintances and people who knew us. I mean, what does it look like to part ways with someone who deeply loves and cares about you and still does? But that would have been living for other people's world. That wouldn't have been living for myself. That would have been living for other people's perception of me. And so when I think about the words, had I not created my whole world, I would certainly have died in other people's. I think that's what I think about. How even when it's scary, you have to do what's right for you in your world. And like I said, I ultimately did the kindest and most considerate thing I could have done because I care and love this person. And we both didn't deserve to be in limbo. And we both didn't deserve to be living in fear. I started this episode with the question, what does it mean to really live free? What does freedom in your life mean? In a clip from the 1970s, in an interview with musician Nina Simone, she emphatically states, "I'll tell you what freedom is to me. No fear." And I think about those words a lot. I've thought about them for years, actually. Every time I'm feeling fearful in life, feeling trapped or stuck in a decision, feeling afraid of a new life chapter or transition, fear feels paralyzing. It feels like you're frozen, wedged between the weight of two decisions. It feels like a swelling in your chest, your heart about to implode on itself. And that doesn't feel freeing. There's no freedom found staying stuck in fear. And while I felt fear about this transition, this parting, I fearfully decided to continue through with it anyway. I decided to move forward anyway, because I knew in the long run it would save both of us a heartache that would have hurt worse. Sometimes you have to make those decisions in life, and it's scary. It's not easy. It's hard. I'll admit that. But like the quote someone shared with me earlier, courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the judgment that something else is more important than fear. And there were more important factors to consider than my fearfulness. And while for the past weeks people have been calling me courageous and brave and strong, I haven't felt that way. Until one day I started to notice and give attention to the micro acts of courage that happen throughout my day, like getting out of bed every morning when I just want to lie in it and cry, washing my face when I would rather let the tears from the night before stay dried upon my cheeks, and diving all into my writing and art, even on days when I feel it serves no greater purpose. I know it will. Even on days when I'm just writing to myself in my journal, I know that's a micro act of courage in the midst of sadness. It doesn't feel big, not in the moment, but maybe it's important in some way. Maybe it's all grist for the mill, as someone who I know would say. I know this transitional period in my life is moving me toward growth, and yours is too. And growth isn't always upward. Sometimes it can feel like uncertainty, like wandering through life a little uncomfortable because you haven't quite figured out what's next. This transitional period has reframed a lot of how I think of myself and what I'm capable of. And whatever you're going through, breakups, whether friendship or romantic, partings, or big life transitions, they can redefine those labels of brave and strong and courageous. Bravery is saying what you really mean and what you really need right now in the present and staying true to yourself. Strength can look like vulnerability and telling someone, hey, I'm really scared of doing this big thing. Courage can look like being honest, even when the truth can hurt, in an effort to be gentle with someone's heart. Even if it means the truth will leave you feeling lonely for an indefinite amount of time, for an unknown amount of time. Courage is facing the unknown, even when it's scary. Earlier, I described the weeks leading up to this transitional period as falling through the air with nothing to grab onto to stop me from falling. I felt like I was falling for so long. And as someone who does not like roller coasters for the stomach drop they give you, that feeling was a scary space to be in. And I didn't want to feel that way. I wanted to avoid the pain, the heartache, the impact of saying goodbye to someone whom I love, whether it's for a season or whether it's for forever. But maybe the point of all of what's happened wasn't to stop the falling, but to teach me that I can survive the fall. And maybe that's the point of big transitional periods in life. Periods where we're afraid of what's next or how bad it's going to hurt. No matter what, you can actually survive that transition, that great big heartache, that great big move, that great big goodbye. Sometimes bracing for impact is scarier than the actual moment of impact. And sometimes falling apart can actually be you slowly falling into the spaces you're truly meant to be. And those spaces are full of courage and bravery and strength. This poem I'm performing is one of my favorite poems I've ever written. And it actually has been a solace for me throughout many tough periods in my life, through many periods of sadness and transitions and heartaches. I actually got the idea for the poem when I was performing one day at an open mic at Elizabeth Street Garden down in Little Italy in Manhattan. The theme of that poetry reading was breath. And so I wrote a poem titled Breathwork. And this is what I'm going to read today. Breathwork by Lauren Summers. This morning, I awoke with unsteady breath, sadness crushing its way onto me. Inhale, exhale, hand over my chest, my awareness exceedingly tangible. I always hated breathwork for the way it holds a mirror to myself. This morning, I tried breathwork in the face of a heartache that took me too long to accept. I try to find solace somewhere in the heavy air that surrounds me, a task that feels too large to take on. How does one do breathwork when each breath brings them face to face with the affliction of existence? Inhale, exhale, hand over my tightened chest. The recollection's much too painful. I want to stop and succumb to sorrow. This morning, I am suffocating under the pain of all that has happened. Inhaling, eyes tightly shut, my exhales wed with hot redemptive tears running down my sternum. My breaths metamorphosing to sobs. Inhale, exhale, hand over my heart. I become aware of its beating and the certainty that I'll survive. My breaths becoming a hymnal of holding on. My breaths becoming a devotion to myself. This morning I tried breathwork, and somewhere amidst the rising and falling of my aching chest, amidst the inhales and exhales that took everything in me, my breaths held a mirror up to me and said, "You remain here. You remain here. You remain here." Thank you so much for listening. If you like what you heard, take a moment to follow this podcast on your favorite listening platform. If you want to connect with me, give me a follow at It's Only Up From Here podcast on Instagram or YouTube, or shoot me an email at itsonlyupfromherepod@gmail.com. This is Lauren, your host of It's Only Up From Here.